Chapter 5. The Search for Heirs Before 1848. Romanticism. The Romantic movement established a communication and a poetical dramatic communion between groups disdained by bourgeois society, women, youth, intellectuals. It inaugurated, at the heart of bourgeois society, an anti-bourgeois shadow society, mysterious and radiant, devoted to love and theatrical declamation. This lived utopia, this naive and subtle revolt, carried with it the hope for a near end to bourgeois Philistinism. In France, Romanticism went further than in Germany, where it was content to dream about everyday life, as in Hoffmann's The Golden Pot, one or else escape into the depths of nature. In France there was a romanticism of the left, represented among other people by the first sociologists, Saint-Simon and Fourier. Marx borrowed certain elements of his thought from this subversive and critical left romanticism. From 1850, and the defeat of the Revolution of 1848, poetic thought in France embarked on a different path. There now appeared, confessedly but in depth, the link between recording and rejecting everyday life, between the themes of the everyday and the city, between these themes and a metaphilosophical exploration of the modern world. This connection is explicit in Baudelaire. The poet's ironic notes on philosophy in general and Hegelianism more specifically, infusés, mon coeur m'est grave nu, etc., do not go as far as the critiques of Marx or Kierkegaard, but they point in a similar direction. What the poet turns his gaze towards is no longer natural beauty and eternal truth. What he listens to is not the divine word. He seeks poetry in what is fleeting and momentary, in the transitory, the everyday, fashion, the spectacle of the street, a Paris changing more quickly than a mortal heart, Parisian paintings. And yet the everyday, the source of poetic vibration, is intolerable. The city has these two aspects, poetry and horror. It is where the fleurs du mal grow. Free it is pure facticity and factitious purity, art and artifice. Baudelaire's most vibrant poems, the simplest ones, those in which he does not exploit the Satanism of an abandoned Christian and powerless anti-bourgeois terrorist, speak the city. Does the great myth of the city derive from what man discovers here, or from the fact that the city begins to overspill the human scale? The one does not prevent the other, but the second event tends to cover over the first. Baudelaire reveals in the city a second nature, which imitates the first, but in order and beauty. This second nature is made up of stones, water, mirrors, metals. It is beautiful, superhuman, inhuman. Where does the poet place himself? He dwells above the city, that giant presence, landscape of stone, monster of humanity and inhumanity. He is at the level of the church bells, listening to their solemn hymns carried by the wind. The city is both the place of the everyday and a refuge against the everyday. The poet, necessarily fallen into the everyday, rejects it. He goes elsewhere. Into an elsewhere that is here. Apostrophe let us leave this country, where action is not sister to dream. Poetry becomes the country and the landscape of the poet. He does not seek to change life, but to transfigure it by means of this philosopher's stone, the word, poetic speech. Rimbaud says more clearly, proclaims more forcefully, what the philosophers do not say, what they will never say since they commit suicide, as philosophers, by the action of saying it. Beauty is lying and dying, truth is already dead. Life has to be changed. Love needs reinventing. The everyday is hell and the season in hell lasts forever. The city traversed by the immense shaking of forces, The holy city built in the West tried one last time to assert itself as law and rule for society, as measure of the world. It made a supreme attempt to define itself, and to define man and human, around its unity and its diversity. This attempt, the Commune, failed, as the creation in Europe of a democracy tending towards socialism had failed in 1848. Rimbaud, after Baudelaire and like Marx, lived the defeat. Not only did he devote a great poem to the Commune, but 3 poems of his illuminations are dedicated to the city, present and possible. For Rimbaud went on to find his own way, or rather his own byway. Poetry in him flared and then denied itself, refusing to degenerate into literature. For in literary success what sought to become the creator of a style of life becomes par excellence literature and trappings. Rimbaud is rebellion in the pure state, the rebellion of a child against the world that crushes him. And what is it that crushes childhood and the innocence of the child? Above all, everyday life, les pieds deceptans. Rimbaud, unable to change life, sought the alchemy of the word, the magical transmutation of the everyday into poetic speech. He succeeded, but this success was a defeat. Nothing changed, except literature. Then he fell silent. He went away, having written, one doesn't leave. Which means, no one ever leaves, since each person carries himself with him. The poet leaves only for silence and death. In the early 20th century a strange mutation took place. The simultaneity of these changes in life and thought, and more deeply in the perception of time and space, has not been sufficiently noted. Competitive capitalism was already over, without those involved being aware of it. The old logic had been shaken, lashed and entranced by dialectical thought for a century and a half. Around 1910, referentials and frames of reference dissolved. The evolutionistic and continuistic conception of time and space became blurred, along with the coordinates to which it referred, and the mechanistic conception likewise. The present was blurred as a point that past and future could be related to in a strict determinism. In the notion of field, which began to invade the domains of science one after the other, past, present and future coexist, and even the future, already present and proclaiming itself in the lines of force, tends to determine the actual instead of being determined by it. In painting, the horizon line completely disappeared, along with classical perspective and the three-dimensional space of this codified and systematized perspective. A system of sensations and perceptions, the visual system, collapsed. So too did another system, that built on tonality in music and song. Tonality disappeared as a reference in new music, atonal, dodecaphonic, then serial. In mathematics, the systematized conception of Euclidean space retreated. This space was now only a single case in the indefinite multiplicity of conceivable infinite spaces. Number, as habitually known and systematized in classical arithmetic, was no more than a set or a body among an infinity of other sets. In physics, Newtonian space is systematized by classical mechanics and represented as an absolute gave way to relativity, the notion of a continuous and completely determined trajectory. This fixed and absolute foundation of mechanics became cloudy at levels that were not those of the customary scales. On close examination, we see that the classical concept of reason and the irrational was obscured and maintained now only by decree, in the institutional sphere. Looking still more closely, we perceive that the notion of a work of art begins to crumble. Was it not Mallarmé who offered his poems as fragments, fallen from an obscure disaster, of one immense poem, a great book that would never be written and could not be written? Language itself, at the moment when it would appear as system and structure, and thus move to first place before reflexive thought, was attacked by the image, a new reality, ambiguous and imaginary, with powers that were poorly defined and perhaps undefined. In all domains, fixed and definitive foundations have disappeared, including formal logic as a referential. We could even say that within praxis and everydayness, the old systems codified and regulated food, clothing, housing and furnishing. These systems were local, regional, national. Some who have studied their debris and survivals have called them forms of life. In the early 20th century, these shattered. A small illustration: women began to imitate masculine dress, and to dress as men. Sensation and perception were subject to new distortions, from the fact that their systematic organization at the current and everyday level disappeared. They were defined locally with increased precision, signs, signals, forms with clear outlines. To this finite and defined aspect, more discontinuous and more distinct than previously, that was integrated into everydayness, was added the unlimited, the undefined, perhaps the infinity of a consciousness no longer confined by any determined horizon. Let us mention here, without insisting on it, this shattering of all partial systems, from which the most factitious, such as fashion, rescued themselves, as also did the broadest, those having an institutional or state guarantee, such as law and philosophy. This will be one of our great objections against structuralism, with its constant emphasis on systems. On the other hand, let us insist on the fact that Marxist dialecticians should subsequently have welcomed such a broad mutation and sought to account for it, whereas they challenged it in the name of philosophical materialism, revalorizing what was collapsing: realist painting, tonal music, non-relativist conception of space and time, and so forth. Why this mutation? We can ascribe it to several reasons and causes: the end of competitive capitalism, this particularly influential and important system; crisis of capitalism, imperialism, revolutionary movement, or again, new technologies, electricity, aviation. These are only partial causes and reasons. There was something more as well. There was the break-up of all frames taken as reference and practice, from the city through to the nation, from the palpable that had been familiar for centuries through to intellectual, philosophical schemas of the cosmos and the world. The city, in particular, began to proliferate beyond its determined limits, to lose its heart, to expand into the suburbs, to empty itself of its palpable substance in favor of excrescences that laid siege to it. Its image cast a final flash of light with poets such as Guillaume, Apollinaire, Blaise, Cendrars, Louis, Aragon, Le Paysan de Paris. It kept the prestige of culture driven to its last refinements of facticity and abstraction, but it lost its sense of a second naturalness. It was faced on one side by lost nature, and on the other by what is beyond anything given and accomplished: dream, idea, spirit. In this connection, we may formulate an extension of the law of uneven development, a law indicated by Marx, and made explicit at the economic and socio-political levels by Lenin. There is unevenness in the relationship of social man to his works, uneven acceptance, uneven consensus, or uneven rejection. Men unevenly recognize themselves in the works, oeuvres, that are offered to them for their self-recognition and acceptance. The realization of the human being in works, including the city, appropriated nature, art, knowledge, is uneven according to eras, classes and groups, sectors. The same holds for alienation. We may therefore speak of a law of uneven realization and uneven alienation. We may also speak of the uneven development of systems. In the age we are talking about here, the early 20th century, the agricultural or village community, which had previously been powerfully systematized, had long lain in ruins. Certain systems grew more remote but broader: religion, philosophy. Certain broke up: competitive capitalism, the traditional family, the systems of perspective and tonality, systems of clothing by sex and age, or of diet on a local and regional basis, and so forth. Others were strengthened, the state in particular. Others again were constituted or began to be constituted in ever readiness. For example, the system of prestige and consumption established around such goods as the motor car, or the technical and bureaucratic system with superimposed controls. God being dead, everything was permitted. The First World War brought proof of this. What Nietzsche had sumptuously pronounced, Tristan Tzara said in 2 little words, Dada. Dadaism proclaimed the end of many systems. It believed it was accompanying the end of all systems, now that the God system, the mainstay and support of the others, had disappeared. It believed it heralded the end of written discourse as a fixed system of reference. In this explosion, what solid remained? What frame of reference? Only one: the everyday life organized by the bourgeoisie, which recommenced and consolidated itself after the war. An insufferable and intolerable frame of reference. How not to reject it? But where to head for? Towards revolution, which the bourgeoisie, based on its solid ever-readiness as well as on its state and its army, succeeded in halting in those countries that were, according to Marx, best prepared for it. There was this in surrealism: rejection, revolutionary hope, disappearance of fixed frames of reference. Confessedly, without theoretical elucidation. After the First World War, surrealism sought to realize the romantic ambition and resume the failed project, the creation of a style of life, the reinvention of love. It also sought to constitute, within the bourgeois society that was re-establishing itself, a second society, that of revolutionary poetry, hoping that this would make the first society explode. At the same time, while the surrealists wagered and staked their lives on poetry, others equally naive, equally authentic, philosophers, bet on philosophy. What did surrealism invent? A new language? Power images? An ideology, or a praxis embodying the theory of poetry? No. A gaze, regard, on the modern world, on the city, on Paris, on woman and women. An imaging or imaged gaze, if you like. A gaze, nothing more, and nostalgic rather than new. The surrealists drove individual rebellion against the bourgeois every day to the point of absurdity. What they counted on was not so much poetry as the action of a revolutionary micro-society, neither secret sect nor mass party, an acting group, laboratory, anticipation, hope, center of radiation and influence. Their revolutionary micro-society had only a minuscule effectiveness, and the bourgeoisie knew how to absorb the scandals, alarming and amusing itself. The demand and thirst for a poetic totality remained unsatisfied. An original element in this poetic thought became a ritual. It was less a matter of changing real life than of crossing the gates of ivory and horn, nerval, that divided the waking state from dream, our bit of reality from a higher reality, the surreal. 5. The philosophical and literary temptation was there from the start: departure for the elsewhere of dream, abstract escape into the world of automatic discourse, Escape into the world, this cosmic and cosmological aspect taken from German Romanticism, novelist more than Hölderlin. Poetic speech and the judgment delivered on the everyday soon lost their authenticity. The creation of style succeeded to a certain point in literature. It failed in life, that is, in praxis. Poorly armed, attaching itself to philosophies, Hegelianism or psychoanalysis as conceptions of the world, sometimes evoking the end of philosophy without meditating on it, surrealism proved unable to tolerate the harsh political reality of the post-revolutionary period in Russia and Europe, Stalinism, fascism. The confrontation between the poetic revolution, the real revolution and its defeats, and the fascist pseudo-revolution, ended in the ruin of surrealism. It left a project in a larval state, unrecognized, little developed, mixed with impurities, but restorable on the basis of a reinvention of poetic thought. This project could only be resumed in terms very different from the surrealist theses about the surreal, the primacy of dreams, the aleatory and verbal invention, automatic writing, a technique that might be worth recommending to a literary technocracy today. And besides, did not Antonio Machado invent a machine that claimed to be surreal? How can the poetic project that underlies a line of poetry be redeemed after a century or more? How can it be melded with a philosophical thought of birth, freed from the one-sidednesses of philosophy? In our view, the project of a transformation of the everyday that would restore its lost riches meets these demands. As a project to restore to poiesis its full sense, production and creation, it stands in the line of poetry, while bound up on the other hand with the superseding of philosophy. After Marx, Nietzsche perceived the exhaustion and deterioration of classical philosophy, its incapacity in the face of new problems. It would be unjust not to give him his place. This is not a matter of forcibly bringing Nietzschean thought into the concepts of Marxist thought, or attempting an eclecticism condemned in advance. But Nietzsche's work has reasons and resonances. One of these reasons, once again for him as for the poets mentioned above, was the temporary defeat of the revolution in Western Europe, in 1848, and the necessity of a quest, an opening and an issue. After Marx, Nietzsche likewise condemned traditional philosophy, dogmatic or critical, to death, in one of the most virulent poems of Zarathustra, Immaculate Perception. The faults and crimes of this philosophy? Nietzsche perceived, as did Marx, the analogy, hidden by controversies, between religion and metaphysics. Religious and metaphysical minds had in common, a little differently but with the same unpleasant fury, a contempt for life. They were the hallucinated of the late world, those obsessed with the supersensuous. Philosophers, too, were slanderers. What Philistinism in their resentment against the senses, their taste for pure ideas. It is a miserable story. Man seeks a principle through which he can despise men. He invents a world so as to be able to slander and bespatter this world. In reality, he reaches every time for nothingness and construes nothingness as God, as truth, and in any case judge and condemner of this state of being. 6. In the whole of philosophy, radical criticism recognizes a way of taking revenge on reality, ruining the conditions of man. It detects the symptoms of a discontent and resentment that finds satisfaction in torture and destruction. The history of philosophy is a secret raging against the preconditions of life, against the value feelings of life, against partisanship in favor of life. Philosophers have never hesitated to affirm a world provided it contradicted this world. It has been hitherto the grand school of slander. 7. Today it is child's play to construct systems. What is needed on the contrary is to make decisions with a long range. There has been something morbid about the philosopher type. It is this type of man and thought that first has to be changed. Philosophy has only constructed the figure of Homo philosophicus, theoretical man. Would this be Homo sapiens? Perhaps, but is it certain? Theoretical man sees himself as thinking and wise, and is perhaps crazy, a buffoon, the fool of theoretical purity, as a certain philosopher called himself God's fool. Nietzsche attacks with greatest violence the hero, the saint, the martyr of philosophy, Socrates. He played a leading role. He founded a human type, the man who finds more satisfaction in seeking a hypothetical truth than in life and living truth. Theoretical man is an optimist of theory. He gets pleasure from it, an artist in his way, and yet an anti-poet because anti-life, anti-physical. Insatiable for abstract knowledge, he is at the same time vulgar, cunning, someone who by the use of concepts and reason has arrived at a strong self-mastery that gives him ascendancy over more vigorous men, healthier than him, but who do not know where their sap and their strength hail from. The false health of Socratic man hides an underlying disease. His cunning conceals a great lack of naivety, innocence, spontaneity. His universal reason dissimulates the absence of freedom and free decision. He creates nothing except himself. He does not found a world. He makes a display of his wisdom among simple people who end up execrating him. Starting from this critique of philosophy and Homo philosophicus, Nietzsche's thought follows an original path. Nietzsche holds a great dialogue with Greek thought, germs of which can be found in Hegel and Marx. His discussion is not with Plato and Aristotle, nor with Democritus and Epicurus. It is with the pre-Socratics who meditated before the great split between poetry and philosophy, between creating and doing, between the decision that founds and the reflection that excavates or re-examines, between saying and discoursing. In first place among these pre-Socratic thinkers is Heraclitus, the poet-philosopher who is seen as obscure. For Nietzsche, truth is poetic in kind. It is offered and grasped in an action thought that creates it by saying it, that speaks truth by revealing it. Truth grasps the person who grasps it. This double grasping transforms him. He is one thing and becomes another. He becomes what he is. This action is accompanied by poetic speech. Only speech, which runs through discourse, can speak. Poetic expression is in no way exterior to thought itself. The principle of ontological repetition, eternize each minute. Live each moment in such a way as to wish it eternal. This principle, which seems passive, is active and creative. It is thus that Sigismund, in Calderon's La Vida es Sueño, cries, since life so short indistinctly weaves together truth and illusion, let us dream, my soul, let us dream once more. 8. And he sets off for battle. An active principle of this kind is, according to Nietzsche, the secret of poetry, the desire of the poet, absolute desire. It metamorphoses into poetry sensation and sensuous perception. The instant becomes moment, eternity. Word becomes action. The act of this thought simultaneously reveals depths and detects possibilities. Poetic speech brings the bright horizon into harmony with the obscurity from which births arise. It seizes from the accomplished its secret, that of the possible. This inaugural poetic act does not involve a procession of arguments and considerations and consequences. It founds a style of life. Nietzsche sought this style both in a heroic creation, the Superman, and in the repetition of the same, eternal recurrence, finally in their identity, the overman, Serhom, being he who offers the truth of eternal recurrence, and consequently the identity of memory and image, knowledge and recognition, birth and resurrection. According to Nietzsche, this unity founds the present, acceptance of the present, the yes uttered before life and inaugurating at last the genuine life, new birth, new innocence. If death bears within it life and life bears death, if sorrow contains joy and joy sorrow, if being and nothingness change places and meld each into the other, then the future is innocent, and being rediscovers great innocence in becoming. Shall we insist on Nietzsche's defeat? Yes. The idea of a new acceptance of life, rediscovering the innocence of spontaneity, is a deep poetic idea. If it is true, as Marx said, that man is separated from himself and from his own life, this image has a sense. But the most poetic speech is not enough to change praxis, even if it says more than reasonable discourse does, even if it is good for it to have been uttered and if it indicates what is possible. In his turn, it collapses into literature. It becomes discourse, in a world of discourse. And philosophical discourses imitate, badly, the speech of the master. This speech does not found a style, that highest work. It strays into poems and tales and anecdotes. Is not the image of eternal recurrence again a philosophical saying? From Nietzsche let us keep the idea of a new alliance between poetry and philosophy, a unity that presupposes the radical critique of these two spiritual activities and their alienating separation. Through this project of a new unity, Nietzsche has more grandeur, a word that is somewhat ridiculous but useful, than the greatest modern poets and philosophers in the age of the withering away of philosophy, phenomenologists, existentialists, historians of worldviews. To reply once again to those who proceed by dogmatic classification and class Nietzsche among irrationalist thinkers, idealists and reactionaries, it is enough here to recall the eminently poetic texts in which Marx proclaimed the unity of the original and the terminal, the ultimate reconciliation of nature and man, existence and essence, being and thought. 9. But we have decided here not to abuse quotations. If each assertion were accompanied by texts and references, then each paragraph would demand a chapter, and each chapter a volume. Examination of Marx and Nietzsche as protagonists of metaphilosophy leads us to Heidegger. We shall find him along the way, as we did Nietzsche. What there would be to say about him will not be completely said, any more than about Nietzsche or Marx. Nietzsche and Heidegger, both thorny cases, and not because of the Nazi interpretation of Nietzsche's thought, a cheating one, or Heidegger's tendencies towards National Socialism. It would be easy to find the same tendencies in French work that is seen as important. Besides, the philosophical political interpretation is out of date. It is not more valid for Heidegger than for Kafka, Joyce or Proust. The question is different. If we consider Heidegger, if we deem him considerable, we are faced with the danger of eclecticism. The pseudo-Marxist eclecticism obtained by mixing philosophical ingredients can serve as a warning. Nonetheless, the risk of a philosophical eclecticism along the lines that pseudo-Marxism was and still is does not prevent us from giving a place to psychoanalytical research, or to Heidegger-style investigation. The only way, to define convergences and divergences differently from on the philosophical level. It is by no longer locating ourselves on the level of philosophy that we shall avoid philosophical eclecticism. Let us clear away, at the start of this discussion, a misunderstanding that has major implications, as it puts philosophical terminology in question. When Heidegger praises the thing, this thing is not the object of any kind. The thing is slender and minimal, even in number, in relation to the swarm of indifferent objects. The thing is the jug, the ring, the mirror, the vase, works of handicraft rather than works of art, but still works, and in no way products, of industry or technical operation in the modern sense. The knowledge of science and technology destroyed things as things, well before the explosion of the atom bomb. They reduced the thing to objective function and operation, those of an object. There are scarcely things anymore, and their thingness remains in the background, forgotten. To make the thing appear again, accordingly, means rediscovering materiality, in the sense in which painters and sculptors speak of the matter that they work, color and clay, marble and its grain. It also means rediscovering the meaning of the thing, humble and sacred, the jug that pours water and wine, that is used for libations and offerings, that gathers around it, a round table or altar, the living and the dead. Or again the wedding ring, this band of gold that unites and imprisons, we may add with an irony that is foreign to Heidegger. Heidegger thus pursues the restitution of the sensuous, or rather of the practico-sensuous, begun by Marx in the 1844 manuscripts, and taken up by Nietzsche. He pursues it in his own fashion, simultaneously conceptual and aesthetic. The thing, as work of creative activity, founds around it an activity, a praxis and even a certain universality of praxis. The words thing and ding mean a matter, everything that touches, concerns, gathers men and everything that is in question. 11. The same holds for the word res publica, the matter, the lawsuit, the case. The thing, as created work, creates a little world around it. Hegel left a great deal of ambiguity in his dialectic around the concept of the thing. In the thing, man realizes himself. He also loses himself. He loses himself to the extent that he believes that things have a substantiality different from consciousness, to the extent that he satisfies himself in a certain thing. He realizes himself to the extent that, through all the imperfect and incomplete things, philosophies, the city, science, he tends towards the perfect and absolute things, the rational world, the reconciliation of subject and object, the Hegelian state. On the one hand, Marx retained the first meaning of the thing. It is reification, Vertinglichung, loss of self in the abstract object, money, the commodity. On the other hand, he retained the second meaning, the product, the work. The abstract thing alienates. The concrete product realizes man, at least at a particular historic moment. Heidegger did not cast light on the question of the thing. He added a new demand to questions already formulated. The more or less technological object, product of the scientific mode of representation, is emptied of poetry. The thing, as handicraft, over artisanale, was rich in poetry. The object is consumed. The thing creates around it a human microcosm. What is the conclusion? Heidegger confirmed an essential point of view. The relationship of man with the thing is an aspect of the more general problem, that of the relationship between man and his multiple oeuvres. Undoubtedly Heidegger's lack of the theory of alienation, of the double relationship with the object and the thing, presence and alienation, reality and reification, prevented him from answering its demand. Besides, the cult of the handcrafted thing, somewhat archaic, translates in Heidegger into a touching sentiment of the home, patriarchal and Germanic. We discover a similar sentiment with Gaston Bachelard, through his refined analyses of reveries on the elements, on space. For Heidegger, the home is the dwelling, stable and sacred, profound and open. The image of the home, of the dwelling, runs through and inspires a wide-ranging reflection on building and inhabiting, deeply connected with techne and poiesis. The home figures and symbolizes the individual being and his consciousness, design, or conversely, it is more than a symbol. It is bound up with serious questions. Being and authenticity have need of a dwelling. Language is to being what the home is to men. The image of the dwelling extends to reflection on thought, sojourn, site, situation. For ourselves, here, it is the city, rather than the home, that offers a capital theme and a profound symbolism. Certainly, the city has always been made up of homes, as society is made up of individuals. But the space and time of the city have always been different from the time and space of the home, without abolishing the latter. There is a different grandeur, a different beauty, a different work, in the city than in the home. The relationship between home and city is rather like that of individual consciousness and praxis, though they should not be confused. Already for Hegel, the Greek polis, cité, was the most perfect thing, a grandeur and beauty destroyed by implacable becoming. What does the end of the city, carried away by time along with beauty, along with many past grandeurs, many ancient truths, what does this presage? What does it demand? What does it expect of us? Let us assert at this point the validity of the Heideggerian line of questioning. Those who immediately protest that there is a contradiction between this assertion and the project of a metaphilosophy are requested to wait a moment. In the 1844 manuscripts, Marx sought to redefine man and the human. In the wake of Feuerbach, he constituted an anthropology from the starting point of the sensuous, the senses and what has a sense, a natural, that is to say, material, sense. Man, as a being of nature, manages in the course of a long struggle to emerge from nature, to dominate it partially and to appropriate it, including the nature within him, his own nature. Man is first of all a being of need. Through want, through privation, through need, each is in perpetual relationship with objects and beings, including other humans for whom he is likewise object. Through labor, man, generic, anthropological, comes to replace the natural objects that satisfy his needs with produced objects. He thus produces new needs, and these needs change into capacities of production and satisfaction. Man, taken generically, generally, thus constitutes his human world, nature and society, though not without being destined to emerge from nature, to pass through the artificial. To the long series of definitions of man by philosophers, Marx added a new one, the triplicity of need, labor, enjoyment. Man is not only a political animal, inhabitant of the city and citizen. He is not only reasonable or rational, using language and concepts. This triplicity encompasses the other aspects, showing their foundation and their truth. Marx bracketed out a series of definitions of man and hypotheses on this paradoxical being, advanced by poets as much as by philosophers. Man laughs, man invented wine and likes to get drunk, man often seeks his joy in the pain of passions, man is familiar with death and knows he is going to die, and so forth. If he does not reject these determinations, Marx either relegates them to second rank or neglects them. He emphasized Homo faber without overly neglecting Homo sapiens. Despite having a powerful sense of humor, he did not place too much emphasis on Homo ridens. And though he showed the importance of leisure, he left aside Homo ludens. He put death and the consciousness of death in brackets. Can we reproach him for this lacuna? Marx stood in the perspective of rational optimism. His thought reflected on life rather than on death, as did Nietzsche's. He vehemently repudiated an ancient definition of philosophy as apprenticeship for death, the wisdom of acceptance. For Marx, the beings of nature struggle and die, but nature is justified, since man is born and with him the human being, by way of history. Marxist rationality thus links up with Nietzschean thought in the justification of becoming. But here is the important thing. The sensations and passions of man are not merely anthropological phenomena in the narrower sense, but truly ontological affirmations. Moreover, only by developed industry, that is through the medium of private property, does the ontological essence of human passion come into being, in its totality as well as in its humanity. The science of man is therefore itself a product of man's own practical activity. 12. Marx rejects in advance an anthropology that would be concerned merely with defining man and the human, by this or that, knowledge, culture, reason, society, etc. If anthropological research is necessary, it is insufficient. It refers to an ontology, exploration of being, or nature, and this is because man, in his praxis, is not isolated from nature but multiplies his links with it. Contradictory links, conflict, struggle, domination, facticity, externality, return to, uprooting and rooting. Besides, knowledge of man does not set itself up above man but is born from him, in praxis. It cannot therefore manage to hold man within a definition. It is he, the human, that defines himself, highly and perhaps infinitely complex. Marx did not develop the notion of nature so as to confront it with that of physis. He drew it from French materialism, and not without criticizing the tendency of this philosophy to mechanistic systematization. He drew it also from German Romanticism, and not without rejecting its irrationalism. Philosophies each criticized one another with the movement from one to the next. Materialism became an abstract spiritualism of matter, and idealism was loaded with mechanism, with Descartes and his school, as with Kant and the physics bound up with his system. The notion of nature received from the philosophies contained a critique of philosophy, since this omitted the real genesis of man and nature, and from it, either explaining this by transcendence or conceiving man as being simply immanent in nature. Marx was content to reject metaphysis and view physis as the matrix of man, a rough and generous mother, a severe educator from whom man distanced himself the better to recognize her by dominating her and one day reconciling himself with her. If there is a transformation of nature into man, and at the same time becoming of nature through man, as the latter creates himself by labor, how and why is this possible? 13. Marx does not go further. He rejects the philosophical representation of nature. Taken in abstraction, isolated and fixed separately from man, nature becomes an object of contemplation, the being other of thought for abstract thought, nature as nature, that is to say, insofar as it is sensuously distinguished from that secret sense hidden within it, nature isolated, distinguished from these abstractions as nothing, and nothing proving itself to be nothing, is devoid of sense. 14. It is certain that Marx would not have accepted any of the positions taken by later philosophy. He could not have considered nature as a region of being, distinct from consciousness and without a profound, ontological link with it. He would not have accepted that nature was the mere residue of the intellectual analysis operated on the sensuous and becoming, or forms constructed by the understanding. No more would he see in it a ready-made will, a wanting to live, a will to power, an impulse, an original life force or desire. On the other hand, in his thought, the Hegelian ideal put back on its feet, identified more or less summarily with material nature, continues to symbolize the inexhaustibility of being. Marx seems to have thought that nature presents and explains itself in the course of the social action, praxis, that emerges from it and transforms it. And yet we may wonder whether reflection on the perspectives of this action, on the reconciliation between man and nature, on the appropriation by man of his own nature, does not demand a new procedure. Nothing prevents us, starting from Marx, from viewing anthropology as insufficient, even if we accept its necessity, and making explicit the concepts of nature and being, on condition that some precautions are taken, and that nature, or being, is never fixed outside of man and praxis, since it, praxis, founds through man and for man his double knowledge, of what there is outside and before him, and of himself. The question can therefore not be raised in philosophical terms, even though it continues the line of philosophy and extends the perspective of the philosophers. Ever since Descartes, philosophy has swung between a metaphysics of the object, the in itself, substance, and a metaphysics of the subject, consciousness, the for itself. The philosophy of substance evolved towards materialism, considered as philosophy. The metaphysics of the subject evolved towards a theory of pure consciousness, of the absolute for itself, from Fichte to Husserl. Both these directions separated nature and being from the acting subject, from praxis. We can see in what way and to what extent philosophy in its decay has maintained this misunderstanding. Official Marxist materialism starts from matter, and believes it has reduced the abyss between object and subject by reducing consciousness to the status of a reflection. Sartre starts from consciousness as consciousness of the other, whether an object or another, and likewise believes he has bridged the abyss. Neither one nor the other has succeeded in doing this, but they are able to dialogue, they are on the same terrain. Can we say that being and nature, viewed as progenitors of the human being, exist absolutely outside of him, before him and without him? Yes and no. Yes, as man is born from nature, the disfavored son promised a brilliant destiny. Nature is, before he arrives, as is confirmed by the history of matter and biological life. These truisms are nowadays trivial, the daily bread of vulgar materialism. And yet, the answer is no if it is true that being and nature have as their destiny the budding, the birth, the accomplishment of the human. Lenin, in the wake of Diderot, wrote in Materialism and Empirico-Criticism that consciousness, as a property of matter, has to be accepted in the very depths of matter. 15 is man, the essence bound up with a primordial and original existence, nature, man beginning with what in him differs from natural being, in other words, thought. Right away we conceive his chance, his growth, his mastery over nature and over himself, appropriation. Is he only a stroke of luck, an accident, perhaps a monster? Then what happens to his chance with destiny? If we are unable to count on being in nature, are we going to wager on antinature? On facticity, culture, and, in psychoanalytic terms, on the reality principle against the pleasure principle? Unless another path can be discovered, beyond essence and accident, pure necessity and pure chance, beyond these philosophical concepts. Starting from these notions, we can examine the work of Heidegger. He was right to question being and nature. He sought to answer on the basis of a re-examination of traditional philosophy, with the perspective of the superseding of metaphysics as well as of philosophical speculation. The investigation of being supersedes the philosophy of the subject and the philosophy of the object, the metaphysical representation of the for itself and the in itself. Heidegger, by questioning being and physis, thus tends to supersede philosophy. Did he completely redeem these categories and concepts from the philosophical tradition? That is a question, the question. In Sein und Zeit, Heidegger shows man and thought cast into the world, into dereliction. 16 Man escapes this by concealing his condition of being for death, in the one, in the inauthentic, in banality. Only the clear night of fear transcends commonplace care. From this point, Heidegger envisaged a new revelation of being. Would this creative unveiling sweep away the triviality of Alltäglichkeit, of everyday care? Undoubtedly. All the same, Heidegger did not envisage the metamorphosis of the everyday as a revolutionary work and project. He undoubtedly still dreamt of transcending it in risk and danger, in the absolute game. Heidegger examined very widely the fate of technology, that is to say, a very contemporary relationship between man and his works, oeuvres. He thus penetrated into praxis to raise questions for it. And yet, what he saw above all in industrial technology was one aspect, the ravaging of the earth, the departure of the old gods and the death of God, the reign of mediocrity, technicians and masses. From that point, he could only describe these ravages, despite announcing in sibilant fashion the new unveiling of being, through technology and beyond it. He was rather too early to conceive technology, a question of dates. He did not discern its most troubling aspect, the simulation of life and thought by technological means, by machines. Heidegger was not able to observe how much this simulation converges with the real, the living, thinking, acting thing, represented as model. Is this not the most contemporary aspect of the relationship of man to his work, his being other, this imitation that turns against its creator and tends to integrate him into it? Does man not cause his own image to arise from nature, like the God of Genesis, only for this image to stand up and confront him? Supreme accomplishment? Prodigiously deeper alienation? Or something else again? What is this technology? Servant, unleashed monster, a golem impossible to defeat? What will machinery be? To answer this, reflection must press forward the line of questioning, think through to the end what it is that technology seizes, and technology itself, by taking it in thought to its ultimate consequences. That is what Heidegger attempted, but without having on hand all the facts of the question. He alone saw the essential thing, technology. Beside him, contemporary philosophers grow pale, aging on the spot. Apropos, we can repeat what Marx said in 1843, the value of Germany lies in philosophical reflection. It is in this way that it is contemporary and present. Heidegger saw that this essential thing, the question of technology, shifted every problem. While other philosophers continued to thrash around in problems, those of knowledge, of idealism and materialism, of the in itself and the for itself, Heidegger, for his part, described and perceived what was new and disturbing in praxis. Did he penetrate into praxis? Heidegger's meditation contains both the best and the worst, the archaic and the visionary, the world of discourse and also poetic speech. Archaisms are his philosophical metaphors, the shepherds of being, language as the dwelling, home, of being. Forward-looking is the effort to conceive the essence of technology, to define the modern world. A world of discourse, the speculative struggles in the garden of Greek roots, the studies on logos and aletheia that are very fine for their part. Poetic words, the exegesis of a poem, Hölderlin's admirable Dicterisch wanted der Mensch, poetically man dwells, is a poetic work, a hymn to the glory of home, but dwelling occurs only when poetry comes to pass and is present. Poetry first of all admits man's dwelling into its very nature, its presencing being. Poetry is the original admission of dwelling. 17. We owe a certain recognition to the man who brought poetry back into the style of reflection, who recognized and declared poiesis superior to technology. 18. Both this side of and beyond the narrowness that is content to act on men, but treat them in terms of pragmata, pragmatically. Poiesis, Heidegger reminded us with luminous scope, was not originally a verbal art, a discursive imitation of nature, still less pure form imposed on verbal matter. In his initial and profound understanding, poiesis was grasped as production, as foundational and creative act. It was not only opposed to physis, not only handcraft manufacture, not only artistic and poetical bringing into appearance and concrete imagery, is a bringing forth, poiesis. Physis, also, the arising of something from out of itself, is a bringing forth, poiesis. Physis is indeed poiesis in the highest sense. 19. Techn, likewise, in these dazzling beginnings of life and thought, does not simply refer to action, but also to art in the highest sense. Techn belongs to bringing forth, to poiesis. It is something poetic. 20. Originally and deeply, poetry is truth and truth poetry, practical truth of action and production. Only later is there a separation of poiesis, physis and techn, indiscernible in a total act of making, effective operation on matter, discourse and verbal act, in short, the different aspects of a differentiated and contradictory praxis. But truth and poiesis have not lost, for all that, their connection and secret harmony. It is up to us to rediscover and renew it. Let us get to the essential by trying to condense, prepared to revise this judgment in order to support and justify it. According to Heidegger, an inexhaustible being appears in appearance, unfolds in becoming, is manifested even in the difference between being and thought. This inexhaustible being, infinite and uncompleted, accomplishes itself in the finite, and in the end of all that is finite, this being sets out on a path towards an unknown terminus, opening dangerous paths for the beings that it launches in its adventure. Man, with his consciousness and his thought, is opening. He is the very opening of being on its unfolding that arises from physis, nature. There is no grasping that does not supersede itself towards the possible, that is not open, that is not project. The adventure of the human being on the possible does not proceed without risk, without death and the acceptance of death, without the virtual annihilation of all existing and everything accomplished. Being does not represent itself outside of the present, outside of presence. I do not grasp it in me, distinct from me. It is in me this opening of my consciousness, perpetual starting point towards the other, towards the possible, towards the horizon. It is this nothingness, this void and this avidness, this basis and this uncertainty. It is this, but not only this, also that, the other, the world, and the site or situation of this and that in the world. We can only have one of two things. One option, Heidegger's reflections are designed to define and determine this inexhaustible being. Knowledge or recognition of being changes the course of history, of its history and of man. It justifies and authorizes sovereign decisions, and will continue to do so. Being receives a name. This theory then falls again into the framework of traditional philosophy. There is a Heidegger philosophy. His fundamental ontology is hard to distinguish from metaphysics and ontics. The definition of being limits it, reduces it to a being, patent, a new figure of the gods or dead god. The relationship of ecstatic consciousness to being requires a name, faith, grace, summons, certainty, inspiration, and so forth. The second option, Heidegger does not define being. In this case, Where should we seek and find how this being offers itself while withdrawing, reveals itself while disguising itself, shines while obscuring itself? Why do we not recognize this movement, at least partially, in the practical alienation and disalienation of man, not excluding the economic, social and political forms of this alienation and disalienation? There is in Heidegger, as in Hegel, the image of an original being from which emanate, while dispersing, a multiplicity of beings, eters, beings, agents. 21 Heidegger, more than Hegel, emphasizes the raison d'etre of each emanation, each dispersion. Is this why there is no theory of alienation in his work? The notion of praxis makes it possible to situate alienations and disalienations in the real combats of man and man. But why should language, and not praxis, be the dwelling of being, the place of revealing? And why language alone? Why not music or architecture, or any presence that is not alienated or alienating, reifying or reified? His investigations bear neither on the accomplished real, nor on the ideal or what should be. They bear on the possible insofar as the possible appears, is discerned, is chosen as such, insofar as there is possibility and impossibility. They thus bear on the complexity and conflicts of a praxis open on the possible and the basis or foundation of the opening up of individual consciousnesses. The shepherds of being? This metaphor comes from remotest times. Chrysias, in Plato's dialogue, says that men are the cattle of the gods, whom the latter guard and protect, with the implication that they also sacrifice and devour them. In Christian imagery, the pastor leads the flock. He is God, he is the priest, and the faithful are sheep, the little animals of the flock, Nietzsche comments. In Heidegger, this image is reversed. We, who? Philosophers? Poets? Meditators? Men in general? Are no longer the cattle of being. It is being that commits itself to our guard. It trusts us and entrusts us with adventurous missions, chiaroscuro messages. We permit it to roam the paths of wandering, to cross deserts and forests, to gather in clearings and pastures, to refresh itself at springs, to find temporary dwellings. To end up where? We lead it where it leads us, in an adventure that is our own. Is this poetry? Yes. That is not an objection. But does this poetry not bypass the poiesis that calls us? Does it not return to philosophy? To a theology, a new mysticism, despite the proclamation that God is dead? This poetry conducts a dialogue with Greek thought in its nascent state. Now we can institute a wider dialogue between praxis and praxis. On the one hand, we have the praxis of the city, cité, at its apogee, carrying discourse to perfection, culture based on the written sign, concrete intelligence, dealings, commerce, between men. On the other hand, we have our own praxis, that of the end, disproportion, explosion, of the herbs, that of operations of the understanding that have become automatic, that of signals and behaviors, a praxis that no longer finds its aim within its limits, but on the contrary its unlimited opening towards an undefined horizon, beyond this gate of death and the possible, the danger of technology, atomic death. Heidegger revealed the point to which our world has changed since Hegel, encumbered, saturated with facts, knowledges, technologies, even though technology was still far from having reached its worldwide endpoint. Worldness, mondiality, does not appear on a clear and free horizon, but by way of enormous entities, the state, and immense mechanisms, dispositives. Opening is thus more important than determination. there is nothing stranger than the transformation of the word Dasein. For Hegel it referred to determined present being, and for Heidegger ecstatic, present being, seized from itself in a productive way. Poiesis is opening, project. Marx opened the way. Let us keep to opening in Marx's sense, in praxis. Heideggerian Dasein, presence to self, to the world, to the other, and of other to self, is posited and presupposed at the foundation of individual existence. As relation with the other, it is defined by alterity, by the indefinable and undefined opening to the other as thing, as other person, as possible. Yet the ecstatic grasp, destined to supersede itself towards ever new horizons, is scarcely more than an individual consciousness. This Dasein does not even have a sex. The Freudian theory of the libido derived from the same sources as Heidegger's thought, in other words Schelling and Schopenhauer, also harking back to a certain tradition of Christian philosophy. St. Augustine, Jensen, Pascal, is often richer and closer to the concrete than is that of Dasein. Beyond the Freudian opposition between the reality principle and the pleasure principle, projecting the superseding of conflict and the liberation of the pleasure principle, can we not conceive the renewal of desire? 22. The project of a redemption of desire purified from the tars of the libido, freed from the constraints of culture and civilization, is poetic in the highest degree. Very different from the cathartic of the nothing in Sein und Zeit, as a vision of the future revealing of being. In psychoanalysis this project becomes a certain practice, even if ambiguous and metaphysically interpreted. It is recognizable in a number of poets, Paul Eluard, René Char, who perhaps do not have the Grundlichkeit and Heimlichkeit of Hölderlin, but whose words speak poetically the purity of desire, a human desire freed from animal desire and social need, a desire recognized and recognizing itself, a desire desiring itself beyond the wished for and the necessary. Poets proclaim desire, as in the same way do certain phrases of the most illustrious musicians. Cast into the adventure of becoming, degraded into inauthenticity, prey to the commonplace, hemmed in by security, Heideggerian man is not the man of need, labor, enjoyment. In relation to labor as to sex, he remains in speculative abstraction. Dasein contains an essential description of the drama of consciousness. Heidegger expressly sought to avoid subjectivism. He did not start from a philosophy of consciousness. Dasein is not consciousness, but its foundation philosophically grasped. Like all philosophical consciousness, it emerges only with difficulty from the individual. Being with an other, miteinander sein, is founded on the individual. When Heidegger speaks magnificently of man who opens his eye and his ear, who unlocks his heart and gives himself to thought, these moving images scarcely have more than an individual meaning. Only language transcends the private consciousness of the individual. When he introduces the people or the nation, Heidegger accomplishes another transcensus, and sometimes a dangerous one. For want of having grasped praxis, he can only remain within individual being or transcend it by hurling it into the abyss. This lacuna has other consequences. As has been remarked more than once, by both philosophers who follow Heidegger and those critical of him, his preoccupation above all with discerning the most general project of the sciences, and the human sciences in particular, his search to reveal and denounce the technological program in favor of his fundamental ontology, leads him to leave the findings of the sciences aside. Or rather, for him there are no such findings. If he does not ignore the corresponding realities, he deliberately disdains sociology, economics and, of course, anthropology. he does not start with an anthropological research, like Marx in 1844, in order to detect its limits, on the scientific as well as on the ontological side, anthropology having also to leave room for political economy, mathematics, sociology and above all history. An old distinction that played a major role for the philosophers is no longer significant or has changed its meaning. Philosophy contrasted quality and quantity. Hegel established a dialectical link between the two concepts, theory of the qualitative leap after gradual and only quantitative changes. Subsequently, with the withering away of philosophy, the two concepts were again disassociated and opposed. In Bergsonian philosophy, the quantitative relates to mathematics, it is abstract and constructed, while the qualitative is promoted to the rank of the concrete, the real, in isolation. Today, however, mathematics has attained the qualitative order, the aleatory, tactics and strategies in acts and decisions, etc. As for the qualitative, that is to say, the immediate, is it not in itself abstract, and more abstract than quantity? The domain of mathematics does not tolerate any limitation. The limits that philosophy assigned it, or still assigns it, have always been swept away. Mathematics advances. It tends towards totality, as is its right. No philosophy can forbid it, neither that of Hegel nor that of Bergson. And yet something escapes mathematics. From the mathematician's point of view, this something is simply a residue, the reduction of which they can always push further. Science rationalizes nature, said Emil Meyerson, but this operation leaves a residue that knowledge drags along with it, that it takes responsibility for. 23 Logico-mathematical reason causes an irrationality to arise before it. If we place ourselves in this residue, we discover that it is infinitely precious, and infinite in the finite that mathematical understanding can grasp. This is drama, of the individual, of groups, of humanity as a whole. Does not human reality have this double determination, number and drama? The two aspects are inseparable. Heidegger, however, dismisses number or perceives only its most derisory implications. He emphasizes only drama, and above all the drama of the individual being, on which basis he comprehends the destiny of man. To perceive the impasse of Heideggerian thought, it is enough to compare his admirable texts on the work of art, and on beauty as revelatory of the true, with the disabused note that follows the study of the work of art and the thing in wholes. After Hegel, Heidegger glimpsed the end of art. This epilogue goes a long way. 24 It is impossible, Heidegger says, to evade Hegel's saying that art is now something of the past. Art thus ends up together with philosophy. But then what of being and the truth of being in beauty? Where is the history of being leading us? If all design has a foundation and raison d'etre, there is no reason to reason itself. If what founds has no foundation, if the bottom has no bottom, if the world only has below it a kind of great game of being, eternal creative child, then thought that seeks to supersede philosophy leads to a philosophy of play. If we hear the principle of reason in the other tonality and think about all we hear, then this thinking about is a leap, indeed a far-reaching leap that brings thinking into a play with it therein being qua being finds its repose. Humans are truly capable of playing and of remaining in play only insofar as they engaged in this play and thereby at stake in the play. 25 A critical analysis that takes its starting point in the empirical, in praxis, reveals the starting point of play and the absence of poetry, their evacuation by technology, their reduction in ever idleness to childish games. The same critical description leads to viewing play as a moment among other moments, love, knowledge, and so forth. The theory of moments overcomes the opposition between the serious, ethical, and the frivolous, aesthetic, as likewise that between the everyday and that which is noble, elevated, superior, cultural. It reveals the diversity of powers of the total human being, powers that come to man from his being, and from being, we can say, to avoid speculative interpretation, from nature in him, from his nature. Restoring and rehabilitating the ludic in its authenticity and intensity, it grants this no privileged status, no ontological profundity. No more to play than to knowing or to fear, to desire or to repose. The idea of a history of being obliges us to reflect on the notion of history and its problematic. Marx only left us fragments, in capital, and sketches, in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, of the total history he envisaged. Can we suppose that it would have avoided the impasses of later historical thought? By tending to a deeper objectivity, it did not allow itself to be trapped in the bothersome dilemma between judgment of fact and judgment of value, between observation and subjective appreciation. It would have included a history of history and of historical consciousness, integrating the historian into historical time. In the same way, it would neither be reducible to a philosophy of history, nor to a history without scope. The later disassociations between economism, which falsely appeals to Marx, and the history of ideas seen as independent of economics, between event and institutional history, these disassociations that have given rise, and still give rise to interminable controversies would have soon been settled if historians had understood the thought of Marx. This deeper historical thought proceeds by a dialecticizing of the concept of time and of the unfolding of facts in time, starting from a global analysis and exposition of praxis, including, it goes without saying, the conflicts of peoples, nations, classes. It is now possible to conceive the integration into historical thought of the study of human needs, satisfactions and dissatisfactions, sensibility and the emotions. Several chapters of this history have been drafted or written. 26 Total history would grasp the entirety of praxis by the extreme links and poles that are everyday life and eminent works. The total history of man can only consist in a history of total man, sense and sensibility, sensations and idea, this total man being always fragmented, always contradictory, in a totality always broken and resumed. The history of the city would make a convincing contribution to total history. The city, ville, is a work of art. 27 The city, cité, is a work of art, continuous creation and action. We can generalize what Heidegger magnificently says of the Greek temples. 28 A certain traditional and traditionalist historical science has committed a great error by grouping together and exalting polis and urbs as one and the same type, seen as variations of the ancient city. The agora symbolizes the Greek city, of which it is heart and kernel, a space sacred but open, empty and welcoming, place of assembly and sovereignty of the citizens. The forum symbolizes the Roman urbs, and beyond the urbs the Roman conception of space and time, society and civilization, a space isolated by prohibitions, a place where civil power protects itself with the aid of religion, augurs, against military leaders, an emplacement where state edifices accumulate, and where institutional right is exercised. However far one goes back to its origins, the Achaeans in Greece, the Etruscans for Rome, a significant difference can still be found. With the growth of cities this was deepened in some respects. In other respects it was later attenuated. Polis and urbs, each in its own fashion, produced in the course of their history a form and a formalism, the logos, with its political applications, that arose from the Greek city, the law that arose from the Roman. Where was this difference born? How should it be understood? How should we follow its destiny? Chance, a fortunate coincidence? The political will of leaders, endowed or not with genius? Geographical, ethnic, economic, political determination? The question will arise later. We have to admit, at the birth of these two cities, a creation, a poiesis, which is also or already a praxis, and subsequently develops with this constituted praxis, which consolidates and metamorphoses itself in this. What did the creators found? Undoubtedly, something other than what they saw or believed. Certainly a style of life, of works of art. Perhaps a perception or a representation of time and space, whereas they simply thought of founding a city. The dialectical movement begun in this way makes it possible to tighten more closely the famous relationship, obscured by scholastic discussions, between masses, individuals and ideas. Creation conceived in this fashion does not substitute an irrationality for the search for a rational determinism and a causal connection. By giving it a different name, for example, birth of quality or qualitative leap, it is brought into familiar conceptual frameworks. But nonetheless we find ourselves in the presence of a new, specific, original element. Either we note the creation, or the search for causal explanation makes differences and specificities disappear. As soon as we consider them, historical births, force and structuring of becoming, we have to conceive this discontinuously, moving away from an evolutionary and continuist pattern in history. Total history presupposes that new elements are introduced into the fabric of becoming, instead of the polarization between events and institutions, founding or foundation, project. These two notions have a philosophical origin, in the same way as those of praxis, appropriation, totality, need, and so forth. Notions that total history cannot dispense with, which in our view history cannot dispense with. Will we succeed in extracting them from philosophy so as to move them into history? Foundation, creation and founding, as well as project, can be represented on the basis of a philosophy of consciousness, a Cartesianism revised and corrected by Fichte and Husserl. All consciousness is act, intention, relationship with an other, object or goal. All consciousness, individual or social, projects and is projected. With the project, with the possible and impossible, and their dramatic confrontation, consciousness disappears. All consciousness seeks to found, and searches a foundation for itself, no doubt in vain. How would it find another foundation than itself, in the abstract purity of its act? It is thus possible to attempt to attain total history on the basis of consciousness and a philosophy of consciousness. Jean-Paul Sartre, in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, seeks to conceive history and historicity in this conceptual framework. Yet it was not from consciousness that Marx started out. He started from physis, from being, and conscious being. Still more, he rejected, in Hegel and Hegelianism, the superfluities constructed on self-consciousness. For him, the human being remains a being of nature, material, even in his struggle with nature. Marx would be prodigiously surprised to see himself appealed to by structuralists, culturalists, and those philosophers of consciousness who cut man off from his foundation in nature. By putting nature in brackets, reducing it to an abstraction, denying it, the philosophy of consciousness risks letting an essential part of content and historicity escape. Our need and desire to be conceived, and thus the transition from one to the other, even if this transition involves reflective will, intention, discursive understanding, society and culture without constant reference to physis? Is it possible to grasp the village and the city, people and nation, even social class, without thinking of the earth, the land, the territory, la terre, au terroir, au territoire? Even the abstraction that separates from it refers to the native soil. How to conceive human works without reference to the matter that is worked, to the senses and sensibility and sensuous activity? How to reflect on thought, without meditating on the difference between being and thought? Between being, living, and thinking, reflecting. How to understand, on the basis of consciousness alone, that men make their history without knowing how? How to understand freedom without this double determination, mastery over nature, nature freeing itself from its limits and man? Claude Lévi-Strauss grasped perfectly well the interest of this question and nodal point. If the starting point of thought is the categories of analytic understanding, and it sticks to these, or if it starts from the intentions of consciousness and maintains itself there, then there is no more total history. There is not even history, as partial history, that of historians, is defined only in relation to a total history aimed at and viewed as possible. The analytic understanding grasps elements, decomposes and symbols into atoms of meaning and reconstitutes them into systems. It privileges invariances to the detriment of becoming the synchronic as opposed to the diachronic. As for thought that takes its starting point and support in consciousness, this grasps individual motivations, impulses, effervescences, or those of groups, but never a historical process. In the project, it attains the subjective aspect and no more. The creative or foundational act essentially escapes it, insofar as it responds with an original and invented, created, relationship to a question raised by human groups in their relationship with nature. According to structuralism, the fundamental operation is that of the analytical intellect that proceeds from the parts to the sum, from elements to the whole, from atoms to their combinations, whether material atoms or atoms of meaning. For this method, the grasp of the general is devoid of meaning. It is impossible. The general and the total are not operatory. For Lévi-Strauss, history that seeks to be total becomes so vague, and contents itself with such general representations, that it amounts simply to a kind of baskcloth on which the objects of knowledge stand out, systems and structures. A truly total history would cancel itself out, its product would be naught. History is therefore never history, but history for. 29. The structuralist negation of history has several arguments at the ready, of uneven importance and interest. Thus Lévi-Strauss is struck by the resemblances, homologies, between the most ancient cities of Egypt and the East and modern towns. The same monotonous grid pattern, the same mass of crowds, the same specialization of working class, residential and administrative quarters. To this we can respond that the analogy of forms and structures conceals profound differences, that we are not entitled to omit the tremendous history of town and city, and that on top of this it is the end of the city that we see as the striking phenomenon, retrospectively and nostalgically illuminating the past. The fundamental argument comes from the functional and operational identity attributed to human understanding in all latitudes and all cultures, which are seen as its constructions, more or less latent and hidden. Now this theory includes an ambiguity and an extrapolation. There is identity of the understanding insofar as the understanding is precisely the function of identity, that is to say, the logical function constitutive of stabilities. But does this thereby include in it the whole of praxis, the whole of consciousness? Does it not postulate, by identifying the understanding with praxis, the elimination of becoming? Does it not omit the essential fact, which is that structures and systems are the mortal and the dead, the bones of the skeleton, the shell secreted by the living creature and abandoned by it on the beach? Lévi-Strauss has a fine time with Sartre, whom he takes as interlocutor and target. By aiming at Sartre he has philosophy in general in view, which is not a problem for us, but also Marx and Marxism. There would be a lot to say, writes Lévi-Strauss, on the supposed totalizing activity of the ego, in which he sees only illusion maintained by the exigencies of social life. Here, Sartre is the target. But it is Marx when Lévi-Strauss goes on to say that philosophy and the philosopher are mistaken when they believe they have attained the being of change. There can be no doubt that Marx believed he had attained the being of change, the essence of becoming, and this, not as a philosopher, but by dialectical concepts, conceiving capitalism and explaining it from its birth to its historical endpoint. Although in both our cases Marx is the point of departure of our thought, it seems to me that the Marxist orientation leads to a different view. 30. This is where they both are wrong. Neither Lévi-Strauss nor Sartre took his point of departure in the authentic thought of Marx, which they both neglected to reinstate. Both started from a philosophy, in one case a philosophy of representation and understanding, in the other a philosophy of the thinking eye. One took as foundation the categories of the analytical intellect, and the other took consciousness of self. They come together in the same negation of total history, or in the same impotence to grasp this otherwise than in its partial aspects, Lévi-Strauss's provisional stabilities, Sartre's effervescences of consciousness. The former pursues this to its logical conclusion, he denies history. Sartre, obsessed by real history and desirous of a dialogue with official Marxism, seeks to conceive total history, but in vain. Structuralism seeks to spirit away history, and by stopping it adjure it to cease being bloody. A good intention, but not one that depends on thinkers. Is technical, operatory, structuralist thought capable of replacing constraint over men with the administration of things? Would it replace struggles between human groups, nations, peoples, classes, by rational and planned organization? Would structuralism, in its own fashion, proceed towards the withering away of the state, by entrusting the question to technicians capable of structuring it rationally? Unfortunately, technocratic ideology seems to be bound up with a state bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is the social force that permits technological and technocratic thought to enter into praxis. Together, in association, politicians and technocrats, whose strategic decisions are not motivated simply by technical reasons, replace the spontaneous self-regulation of competitive capitalism. They are better able to make use of precise technological mechanisms for controlling praxis. Can we then count on technological thought rather than a renewed democracy to realize the withering away of the state and the replacement of constraint over men by the direct management of things? In the structuralist hypothesis, the historicity of human being, is simply a residue left by the analysis of systems, themselves constructed by the analytical understanding. Let us accept this, and repeat that we consider this residual as infinitely precious. According to the program of a total history, what comes into being and survives has a rationale, as Heidegger stipulates in the principle of reason. Everything, events, institutions, works of art, even crises and bloody changes. Splits and alienations also have their reason in the being of man and his relationship with being, nature. Splits and alienations have allowed something, made possible a further development, as Hegel already knew. The point of view of alienation would thus be defined and limited as an anthropological point of view. By limiting it in this way, we open it onto a broader horizon. It would be overcome, without disappearing, by total history. Nonetheless, on the path of dialectical thought, the reason of what has been generally appears only later, in development. For Heidegger, was reason not to be found above all on the site of birth, of the original? He seems to hesitate between raison d'etre and the original and the possible. For Hegel and Marx, necessity reveals itself to be freedom, or rather it changes into freedom, and this freedom, which is concealed in necessity and subsequently reveals itself, is the reason of history. There is a difficulty here. Do we encounter a contradiction between being and freedom? Shall we find another path, beyond the philosophies of being and freedom? In order to understand total history, we must first of all experience the presence of history, writes Heidegger. And first of all we must detach ourselves from the historiographical representation of history, which grasps history as an object, wherein a happening transpires that is, in its changeability, simultaneously passing away. 31 No doubt. A history of actions, decisions, foundations, goes from the present to the past. It starts from an experience, the continuous presence of what was formerly founded in relation with the being of man, in praxis. But if language is the depositary of these presences, is it their agent? Is it endowed with a sovereign power? We are scarcely beginning the dialogue with the present past or past present that has run through time up to now, with what founds and creates, what is perpetuated in us, with nature and being. Where will this dialogue lead us? To invent new words? Or a new praxis? It is true that being and nature change for and through man. It is true at the same time that the history of man is not separated from nature, which has a history for and through itself. It is true that the human being, appropriating nature and his own nature, reveals and deploys, but also deteriorates, what is hidden in him as nature or essence. It is true that alienation and disalienation play a strange and complex game, that social man derealizes himself in realizing himself, that he uproots himself in rooting himself, and vice versa. In order to rediscover nature, he passes by way of extreme abstraction and extreme facticity. By unfolding, developing, he destroys a part of that which was created. He keeps another part of it. He remains in the presence of what was founded. Linear temporality does not exhaust becoming, no more than does cyclical temporality. The praxis that creates and destroys is also itself created and negated. Acts, decisions and words found modalities of praxis, which the latter verifies, reveals, unfolds, contests, which it dissolves by criticism and action, which it transforms, annihilates, overcomes. As soon as there is a margin of freedom, a new dimension in relation to nature, a relative independence in the interdependence between social group and nature, as soon as there is culture, or more exactly praxis, it was necessary to decide, to create. Creation had something arbitrary about it. The work of freedom delivered to chance and fate, destined to become great or mediocre. Men founded customs, cruel or kind, styles. Everywhere that there was style, or the attempt at style, it had to be founded. The notion of a natural and spontaneous transition from nature to what is no longer natural, the city as well as political construction or art, can no longer be maintained. This transition also had to be decided. There were leaps, creation of qualities, thus decisions and obscure wagers. To illustrate this dialectical movement, creative act created work, we previously took a fragment of the long history of one of the finest human works, the city. We observed a fundamental difference, dating from the foundation and founding, between the polis and the urbs. In this period, creation, saying and making were still not separated. Naming and denoting what was being born, in order for it to grow, was a single act. Religious solemnization and the rites of foundation were not performances, but ways of accepting the risks of the situation created, of committing oneself to maintaining the new work, eternizing it and being eternized in it. The sacred, before being institutionalized, well before becoming attitude in theater, and justifying the private appropriation by those in charge of a work common to the people as a whole, accompanied foundation. The founder, the foundation and the founded were hard to distinguish. Let us go back again towards these sources. Let us try to grasp better both the original unity and the splits that were effected within this unity. Splits both generative of history and produced by a history, episodes of the production of man by himself on the basis of nature, both alienating and productive. After the great separation, each specialized activity went in its own direction, poetry wandering in the verbal imaginary disassociated from the rational, philosophy becoming fixed in formal abstraction, practical knowledge and fragmented science, practical action and the empiricism of current opinions and political power. Pre-Socratic thought stood within a concrete totality in which these differences germinated without yet producing themselves. When Heraclitus symbolized the logos as an ever-living fire, in measures being kindled and in measures going out, exchanging itself with and against everything as gold for wares, and wares for gold, these were not just words of rhetoric. The Heraclitean logos is act, measure, law. It coincides with creative and devouring fire, that of the hearth, the forge, of wildfires and volcanoes, that of the sun that warms the earth without burning it, not letting the earth lose itself in icy darkness. Fire governs itself according to the reason that it bears within it, which it is. It is one and all, and wisdom knows the thought by which all things are steered through all things. Logos and fire negate and destroy, arousing and devouring according to rhythms that are those of nature, of the city, of thought. The same tension of a string kills with the bow and rejoices with the lyre. Tensions, and the harmonies that result from tensions, as in the bow and the lyre, are equally found in natural life as in the life of the city. Heraclitus does not dream about fire or lyre. He reflects, symbolizes, that is to say, discerns an ontological correspondence. He simultaneously perceives and conceives. As a poet, he does not operate on a distinct verbal matter. These specializations, artistic work on verbal matter, reverie on the elements, abstract use of symbol and concept, would come later. Heraclitus does not employ symbols and images different from those of coherent, logical discourse and superimposing themselves on this. Myths and logos are not opposed. Neither are reflection and action. In Heraclitus the emphasis is naive and natural, his assertions are spontaneous, and his humor is cruel. Indeed, is there in him emphasis or derision, assertion or negation, metaphor or hyperbole? The figures of rhetoric are not yet formulated as such. Heraclitus's reflection is act, even civic and political act. Those who speak with understanding must hold fast to what is common to all as a city holds to its law, and even more strongly. 32 Logos, the law of the world, is also the law of the city, which unites opposites in it and forces them into harmony. The later splits resulted from the division of labor, the separation between manual labor, left to slaves, peasants, artisans, and intellectual labor, between material production and the conduct of men. Action is distinguished from production, and the production of works of art from the production of objects. With these splits, while artist is distinguished from artisan, each equipped with his own techn, the man who acts on matter is not the man who acts on men, who conducts commercial or political affairs. If, artisanal or artistic, work is gradually distanced from the product, at the same time action in the social, trade, education, politics, is distanced from production in general. The levels that will increasingly characterize societies by their existence and distinction, that is, the economic, the social and the political, sketch out the genesis of their differences at the heart of the Greek polis and its unity. Not that there is complete separation, this never took place, but rather superpositions and interferences characterized by the use of resources and goods and men on the part of society, in an aim set by such and such a group or individual that is representative. In this separation, poiesis deteriorates into poetry, operation on verbal matter, discourse still inspired by images and symbols, but close to commonplace discourse and defining itself in relation to this. Poiesis forgets that it is also praxis, action on men by works and speech, education, formation, foundation. As for praxis, it establishes itself at the level of exchanges through discourse, through trade, through contracts. It forgets that it was initially poiesis, creation of a habited and habitable human world, dwelling of a truth in the community. In Callicles' famous speech, in Plato's Gorgias, this split is certainly manifest with brilliance and cynicism. Callicles notes the separations, and knows how to take advantage of them. For him, empirical life is opposed to the contemplative life that claims to stand on the level of the soul, of beauty. Practice no longer has anything in common with theory, or experience with poiesis. He deliberately renounces the quest for totality and the universal. He rejects theory, not on the level of theory in favor of another theory, but that of an attitude towards life. He wants results, efficacy. He is the man of praxis, or rather of an aspect of praxis. He is solidly established in the real, immutable particularities and circumstances. Philosophy, for Callicles, leads nowhere. It raises the problem of life only poorly, as life is defined only empirically, socially, politically, as a function of the result to be obtained. The philosopher seeks to be educator, legislator, man of universal logos and generator of the universe. But the philosopher does not know men. Knowledge of man is obtained only through empirical praxis. And it is praxis, empirical or political, that creates the state, a different state from that wished for by the philosopher, the social state which has nothing in common with the ideal or poetic state. Logos, for Callicles, is simply discourse, a coherent principle of action oriented towards the result, instrument of power far more than way of truth. 33 With the separation of different aspects and levels of human life, there appear mediations and aspirations to rediscover the broken totality, attempts that are in part nostalgic, in part full of hope. We have discerned, at the lowest rank, life simply and empirically lived in social practice, labor, trade, family life. This existence is simply submitted to in relation to those who orient or dominate praxis. It is the domain of opinion. People imitate each other's opinions. They repeat each other with the same gestures and words. They also imitate leaders. Naturally, each trade has its own gestures and words. Everyone adds his own touch and his grain of salt to what has been said and done by others. Yet at this level, praxis is simply repetitive. At a higher level, it imitates and, without wishing to, without knowing. It does not repeat what it imitates. It creates something new. Men make their own history, but not of their own free will. And, just when they appear to be engaged in the revolutionary transformation of themselves and their material surroundings, in the creation of something which does not yet exist, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis they timidly conjure up the spirits of the past to help them. They borrow their names, slogans and costumes. 34. Mimetic praxis is imitation of other people, of leaders and ethical models that are on offer. Far above this inferior praxis, certain men seek an effective action that consolidates the existing by eliminating incoherencies, contradictions, while subjecting it to their power. These are the men of political reflection and action, men of the state. Their decisions are of two kinds. Some strengthen what has been achieved by way of laws and institutions. Others, more rarely, change something, found something, a monument in the city, an activity, a way of living. It is at this level that groups and classes intervene. These bases permit strategies. Between the two lie attempts to formulate lived experience beyond particularities and opinions, to put an end to incoherencies and attain an ensemble. The now disjointed totality seeks itself, projects itself in images, in symbols. Art in its way tries to totalize, praxis. Philosophy likewise. Philosophy is defined by the search for an autonomous theory, different from both religion and art, from science and from political action, despite being mingled with these modalities of praxis. An ever-vain effort, always partial, always renewed, in essence unachievable, because partial at the very start. Philosophy is a modality of discourse aiming at a total and totally coherent discourse. It seeks to master men as knowledge, in order to master nature. It wants to orient them, insinuating its science and wisdom into them. It wants to arrive at this mastery by theory, by discourse employed otherwise than in pragmatic and empirical action. It projects a realization of man in the city or, if need be, outside and against the city. Relative to the circumstances in which the philosopher reflects, and which it reflects, it is no less propelled by a movement of its own, contradictions between its postulates and its aim, between real discourses and the total discourse, and above all between the philosopher and the non-philosophical world. The philosopher observes the non-philosophical world at these various levels: opinion, repetitive and mimetic praxis, political decision and political foundation. He contemplates it. He seeks to change it by putting an end to a separation that, however, is what constitutes this world as such. The philosopher, from the time of Socrates and Plato, is fated to understand, to seek to understand everything, not to understand everything, and above all to be understood and seek much without accomplishing anything, on account of being deprived of the means of practical action. Philosophy is destined to incompleteness and conflict, satisfaction dissatisfaction, but also to promote an image, a project, of human realization and unrealization, satisfaction and dissatisfaction. What does alienation consist in the human situation that is sketched out in the Greek city? It is multiple. Man is divided. The product distances itself from the work to become a thing. Society becomes an abstract thing. By political decision and the state, men, citizens, are led to aims that they are ignorant of, with those who lead them not knowing where they lead, and often not knowing anything, except that they have the political means to go in this direction. The result is that the means govern the ends, and that the citizens, these men of the city in everyday praxis, themselves become means and instruments. These are the alienations, economic, at this level, repetitive, social, imitative, political, instrumentality of men, and philosophical, split both combated and confirmed by the speculative attitude. Language, formalized by writing, receives during this period an ambiguous status, which is subsequently aggravated. More end than means in poetry and literature, it is both, and in turn, end and means in practical conversation, in the experience of opinions. It is means and instrument in political discourse, in rhetoric and the art of persuasion, origin of dialectic, in sophistics. The philosopher would like language to become, through him, both means, of act, of persuasion, and end, total and totally coherent discourse, which involves certain difficulties. Besides, oddly enough, what enables the philosopher to play his game is that the circle is closed. Completely a means, language once again becomes end, play on words, riddles, heuristic. We could say that poiesis is perpetuated in intellectual work, which is individual work in a social framework, accomplished by an individual, himself divided, active life and contemplative life, body and soul, need and desire, etc., but who tends towards the universal. As for the praxis of a society divided into masters and slaves, possessors and non-possessors, powerful and weak, it gives rise to the practical will and the will to will. But the latter splits in turn into good will, to keep to the law, seek an ideal, and the will to power, ambition, appetite for power, will to dominate or possess. Works conceived in this way, in a very broad sense, are based on an existing praxis and found a new praxis, more or less transformed. Between the old praxis and the new modified one, something more or less important has happened. Symbols, images, signs, have had and still have a practical efficacy. Words have been uttered in historic time, overspilling a discourse confined to giving proper form to the acquired and accomplished, creative words, introducing something new. We thus pursue the analysis of this reality that is so complex and rich, praxis. We discern in it the unforeseen and the predictable, determinism, chance, will. We also distinguish in it repetition, imitation, more or less passive or active, creative invention, sometimes striking, sometimes unperceived at first. Between these different things there is certainly no absolute boundary. Repetition, whether of gestures, behaviors or movements, mechanical movements, tends to establish itself outside of vital and cosmic rhythms, in the form of linear time and homogeneous space. Creation, unpredictable in invention and the consequences of invention, is in the extreme case genius. As mediation between the two, mimesis follows models, and in the extreme case identifies with or opposes itself to them, father, leader, master, idol. Taken in its full scope as totality, praxis includes creation as well as continuation, revolutionary praxis as well as repetitive praxis, along with their connections. Within praxis, there is a difference between what is being born and what is continuing, between what founds and what is founded, a difference that corresponds, up to a certain point, to the familiar difference between qualitative leap and quantitative unfolding, between growth and development. To resume the history of the city, ville, let us examine a medieval town, cité. First of all, a small market is established, near a ford or a crossroads, or a feudal fortress. It expands. And then one day there is a community, the beginnings of a town. Who named the city? Who gave it its laws? Who perceived its future? The person who founded it. Later, around its monuments and public buildings, people busy themselves, produce, exchange, talk, discuss. that is the praxis of the city. The monuments and buildings, churches, palaces and even empty spaces that are developed, squares and markets, are vital centers of this practical activity. They gather people organically. They impose rhythms and the nature of activity, commercial, religious, political. Monuments and institutions bind the city together and make it a whole. They were founded, and the city maintains them. At the same time, they have a certain beauty. They are eminent works. Around them time and space are organized in an original way, and also an image of man and the relations between men. The act that pronounces and lays down a law, the decision that triggers a revolution or a war, the gesture and word that create a city or a nation, have unlimited consequences in praxis. However, they would not have been able to survive as events without a preliminary praxis, proposing possibilities. The verified praxis, that is to say, renders real or unreal, true or false, absurd or effective, the acts and decisions, words and works. Yet this notion should not be fetishized and fixed in the philosophical form of an immutable criterion of the true, necessarily pragmatic. On the contrary, it has to be dialecticized by reinstating all the modalities of creation into its concept, in order to become fully historical. Among the conditions of merchant capital that appears precisely in these medieval cities and their environment, did there not have to be a reintegration of the formal logic invented by the Greeks, and legal formalism, the law of private property and contracts elaborated by the Romans? These forms came down the centuries. Did they not enable, as forms, the accumulation of a certain content, knowledges, technologies, wealth, which would lead around the 16th century in Western Europe to a vast and multiform cumulative process? Did not logic and formal law already contain, implicitly, the project of unlimited accumulation, by an internal dialectical movement stronger than the form as such? Logic and law were empty forms. They constituted almost perfect systems, as susceptible to agimatization as mathematics. They were bound up with identity pure and simple, the place of truth retained by the philosophers. But because they were empty, the logical form and the legal form could contain, pronounce and stipulate an unlimited number of equivalences, the former in discourse and knowledge, the latter in contractual exchanges between merchants and proprietors. And this was in praxis. These forms, moreover, gave only the possibility of accumulation. This possibility appeared in its link with the form only after the event, after it was accomplished. How and why did these two systems, these two forms, logic, as form of accumulation of techniques and knowledges, and law, as form of accumulation of wealth and private property, converge in the city in the course of the Middle Ages? If we neglect these conditions, which also include the dissolution of the peasant community in which patriarchal egalitarianism was opposed to the accumulation of wealth and its investment, the conflicts between the urban bourgeoisie and the feudalists based on territorial domains, signori territoriali, facts likewise characteristic of the European West, we fall into a philosophy of history and philosophical abstraction. Whoever says philosophy, says one-sidedness. Total history seeks the totality of these practical conditions of possibility, which are not at all speculative and abstract. Marxism, systematized as philosophy of nature and history, or even as economism, has so far given a poor answer to the question raised by Max Weber, why capitalism in Western Europe and not elsewhere, in China or in the Islamic lands? Is it not because a certain type of man appeared there, or a certain culture? 35 Marxists have not even been able to develop the very precise indications of Marx and Engels. Logic and law, droit, having survived the conditions in which they were formulated, are not simple superstructures that disappear along with their base. They differ from ideologies as institutions. Does this mean they are structures? Certainly, structures of the accumulation process. It would remain to explain precisely why and how these structures are structures, which refers us to a historicity deeper than the structures that it bears and contains, that it forms and dissolves. Who introduces them into praxis, transforming existing praxis? How? Who founded capitalism, obscurely or in a striking way? In a total history, the oaths of the sworn communes of the 12th and 13th centuries, the struggles of the bourgeois against the territorial lords, seigneurs, the foundations and works of this bourgeoisie in its urban domains, seigneuries, its transformation into patriarchate and its decline, its replacement by a new bourgeoisie of manufacturing entrepreneurs, are equally important as techniques, facts about material production, or events that are strictly political. There were moments of creation, men and acts that founded something, that oriented the subsequent course of history and praxis. So as to render more actual and concrete this notion of historicity, let us now take the most striking and recent example. Around 1905, after the defeat of the revolutionary attempt that took place that year, Lenin discovered the revolutionary possibilities of the peasantry. He glimpsed the conjunction of these possibilities with those of the proletariat, and projected a political strategy based on this conjunction. Let us leave aside the rather awkward fact that Lenin took over, with his own manner and style, certain ideas belonging to those whom he was opposed to, and who were opposed to him, populists, Narodniki, the left socialist revolutionaries. He even had the cleverness or dishonesty to take over a part of their program, agrarian reform, which in itself was only a reform, and the meaning of which Lenin changed by rejecting the municipalizing of the soil, or its socialization, in favor of state ownership, etatization. We know that Lenin initially viewed the peasants as no more than a supporting force. Subsequently, history went much further, as the revolution was continued in the so-called underdeveloped countries. As sorcerer's apprentice, Lenin triggered forces that went differently and elsewhere than he had intended. With him, history bifurcated. Lenin switched the points, with a very small change of direction initially, but increasingly large over time. To use another metaphor, he did not add water to the river, he changed its course, as the result of a theoretical decision. The social forces existed, on an economic base. They made certain actions possible. By giving these forces political form, by determining the strategy that the base permitted, Lenin founded, created a total history which would make room for all these elements, situating them in their relationships, would bring an end to the stagnation of historical thought, its retreat in the face of anti-historical ideology, structuralist philosophy in particular. It would include a history of human needs, even, why not? Desires and dreams. In this way it would take up the Marxist idea of the production of man by himself, with its double aspect, everydayness and eminent works, mimetic behavior and invention, positive forming and creative contestation. Outside of this total conception of historicity, the Marxist concept of superstructure, understood one-sidedly, degrades into the historico-sociological concept of institution, culture, ideological representation. It is at the same time too narrow and too large. It does not coincide with that of work. In the same way, the concept of structure, perfectly legitimate in certain conditions, having its area of validity, is extrapolated into an ideology, structuralism. When extended into a general conception of operation and function, it no longer coincides with that of form. And finally, again in the same way, the concept of base deteriorates into a simplistic economism, a rather crude material productivism. These deteriorations correspond, in the majority of cases, to philosophical interpretations that are grafted onto a science, history or political economy, or onto a certain concept, by hyperbole, metaphor, extrapolation. Structuralism is a very elaborate philosophy of structure. Productivism is the philosophy, a very rough one, of a praxis that is historically determined but interpreted and made into ideology, with its materialist generalities, its ethics of labor, its realist aesthetics, its political concepts justifying the state. At this point in the presentation, metaphilosophical thought can situate itself more clearly. It explores a totality, the modern world. In order to know the ruptures that break this totality, it seeks to perceive its levels and gradations, its critical phases, contradictions, such as the contradiction between the integrating and totalitarian character of technological and political apparatuses in present-day society, and the explosion of systems and totalities, the city, the nation, culture, etc. In itself, metaphilosophical thought attempts to reconstruct the totality, and first of all to reunite poetry, or rather poiesis, and philosophy, at a higher level than that of their ancient split. It seeks to be action thought, reconstituted unity of understanding and practical consciousness. This book is